on pre-Socratic philosophy. We looked at the first three philosophers, the philosophers that came out of Miletus. So we looked at Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. And those first three philosophers, as we mentioned, were interested in figuring out what the basic stuff of reality is. So now we're moving on to those first three ideas. And we are looking at a new group of philosophers. These are philosophers that are still before Socrates, which again is why they're called pre-Socratic philosophers. But you'll see at this point that there's a number of different ideas that are popping up, trying to figure out what reality can be reduced to. So we might say that the first three philosophers advocated some form of materialism, that everything can be reduced to some material substance, whether it's water, some sort of indeterminate boundlessness, or air. Well, then you get a group of philosophers known as the Pythagorean philosophers, who were following their leader, Pythagoras. And they rejected materialism, and they argued that everything can be reduced to mathematics. They can be reduced to numbers. And this is a really interesting idea in the history of philosophy, because it gets us to think about why it is that we can know anything at all. So it's interesting that we can think mathematically. So we can describe things in the universe using mathematics. We can describe music, distances between objects. If you think of physics, you need to know a lot about mathematics to be able to do physics well. The temperature in the room. Everything can be described to some degree using numbers. Now, why is that? And furthermore, why is it the case that we can figure out the mathematics in our head or on a piece of paper, and then we can do experiments in the real world, and the numbers that we figure out on paper can correspond to the way the world actually is? There's something mysterious about that. So, for example, if we want to figure out how far we could shoot a cannonball, well, if we could measure the height at which the cannon is placed, if we could measure the velocity at which the cannonball is shooting out of the cannon, and we can measure the resistance, all the different factors, numerical factors involved in shooting the cannonball, the weight of the cannonball, everything. If we could measure that on paper, we could predict with precision where the cannonball would land, assuming that we know the arc, the velocity, all of that. Well, we can figure that out on paper, and then we can run outside and do the experiment, and if we do our calculations correctly, the cannonball will go exactly where it's supposed to go. The Pythagoreans looked at this, and they tried to give an account for why this is so. And they argued that for math to work, it must mean that the reality that we observe around us is, at the end of the day, reduced to mathematics. We could think of this today. I mean, there are some thinkers out there today that think that we are in some sort of computer simulation. So you could think of the Pythagoreans as being the first to have some sort of idea like that. But we think mathematically, and our mathematical thoughts correspond to the real world around us because the world itself is mathematics, and that's where you get this idea of correspondence. And so that was the Pythagorean idea. Well, after the Pythagoreans come a few other philosophers. We'll talk about Parmenides first. Parmenides wanted to go back to the original Milesian philosophers, but he didn't want to figure out what the basic substance is that everything reduces to. Instead, he argued that everything reduces to one unchanging being. So he liked the idea that the first philosophers were putting forth, but he just didn't want to specify exactly what that substance is. It's just one unchanging being. And Parmenides has the famous statement, whatever is, is. Now, on first glance at this statement, it might not seem that profound, But if you think about what Parmenides is getting after, there is something profound about this. So if you ask the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Or if you ask the further question, can something come from nothing? You can do a thought experiment and come up with some paradoxes about the nature of change. So Parmenides, when he says whatever is, I think what he's saying is that the reality that we observe around us is just one unchanging being. Now, this might seem strange because it seems as though things are always changing. But for Parmenides, change is an illusion. And he argued that change is an illusion because he said if we think about it rationally, if it's the case that something can't come from nothing, then reason would tell us that everything is one unchanging being. Ultimate reality is an uncaused being. And so why would Parmenides argue this? Well, if we fast forward a little bit through the history of thought, and we think of two different notions of time. So sometimes philosophers will advocate for what they call a B theory of time. So if you think about a B theory of time simply says that all of time from, say, the beginning of the cosmos to the end of the cosmos is all present from an eternal perspective. So if you can step outside of the timeline, you know that right now, inside the timeline, we're experiencing the present. This present is this very thin slice of moment that we call now. But if you step outside the timeline, everything exists all at once. And the past is just to go to the left of the timeline, and the future is just to go to the right of the timeline. But everything exists right now from an eternal perspective, if you can step outside of the timeline. And I think this is sort of what Parmenides is getting at when he's saying that everything is one unchanging being. That we experience time, we experience things changing from inside the timeline. But if you step outside of it, you notice that there is no change. Everything is just simply there. Well, what's the alternative to this? Well, the alternative is the A theory of time. The A theory of time says that the only thing that exists is the present. So the present is that moment that's going across your screen right now. And if you notice the dotted lines are moments that used to exist in the past, but those moments don't exist, at least from an eternal perspective. So on an A theory of time, if you step outside of the timeline, the only thing you would see is the present, that very thin slice that we call now. And so in A theory of time, the past doesn't exist. It used to exist. The future doesn't exist. Presumably it will exist in the future, when the future becomes present. From an A theory of time, the only thing that exists is the present. So I think what Parmenides is arguing against is the A theory of time. And this is what he means when he says change is an illusion. Because if you think about the A theory of time, it would imply that something is constantly coming into existence out of nothing. Well, why does it imply that? Well, if things are changing, then things are unstable. And if we think of, let's say, an acorn becoming an oak tree, so we like to think of that as changing over time. But what is bringing the acorn or the oak tree into existence? Does it exist in the acorn itself? It seems as if, according to Parmenides, if things are constantly changing, then what you're really saying is things are constantly coming into existence out of nothing. And this means that you're an entirely different person than when you first started this lecture, because all of your thoughts are changing, and those thoughts are constantly coming into existence out of nothing. Zeno was a disciple of Parmenides, and he really liked this idea. So he defended Parmenides' ideas using what's called a reductio ad absurdum argument. So this is the type of argument that you use it against an opponent that you're trying to defeat. And so what you do is, for the sake of argument, you assume your opponent's position, and then you reduce that position to logical absurdity. And if you can do that, you show that your position is the correct position. And so this is what Zeno is doing in his paradox of motion. So let's think through this paradox for a moment. So Zeno says, let's assume there's an infinite number of points. Well, if there's an infinite number of points, we could think of this, well, let's just think of this in two ways. Suppose there's an archer that is trying to hit a target. If there's an infinite number of points between the archer and the target, then this leads to some absurd conclusions according to Zeno. So for the archer to hit the target, first the archer will need to shoot the arrow halfway between himself and the target. And after the archer shoots the arrow that far, then the arrow needs to go another fourth of the distance to get to the target. Then it needs to go an eighth, a 16th, on into infinity. And the absurd conclusion is, if there's really an infinite number of points, the archer could never hit the target. Now you could also think about this thought experiment in terms of moments of time. So if it's the case that the archer, if there's an infinite number of points in space between the archer and the target, Zeno argues that the arrow will never get there. Well, if there's an infinite number of points in time between the time the arrow leaves the archer's hand to the time that it hits the target, then it also seems to be the case that the archer will never reach the target. And so this is the famous thought experiment done by Zeno. It's his paradox of motion. Well, what is he trying to prove in this paradox? What he's trying to prove is he's trying to prove that Parmenides is right, that everything is one unchanging being. In other words, he's giving a defense for a position called monism. Monism is the view that everything reduces to one basic thing. And he's also arguing against an actual infinite. So infinity, according to Zeno, might be a concept that we can think about, but it's not something that could actually exist in the real world. There can't be an infinite number of points between the archer and the target. There must be a finite number of points, and for him, there's just you're just looking at different slices. Again, if you step outside the timeline, you're just looking at different slices of the timeline. And in other words, the arrow is always at rest. It just depends on when you're pausing the timeline and you're looking at the arrow. So it's a defense for monism. So again, he defended Parmenides using a reductio ad absurdum argument. We assume that there's an infinite number of points. Well, this leads to absurd conclusions, which means motion must be an illusion. The arrow's always at rest. Reality is therefore one, immovable, eternal, uncreated, unchanging being. And this also leads to a philosophical idea called determinism, which we'll talk about more when we get to this, more about this idea later in the semester. But really, it's just the idea that every event is determined by some sort of prior cause. After Zeno comes a critic of both Zeno and Parmenides. His name is Heraclitus, and he actually takes the exact opposite position of both Parmenides and Zeno. Heraclitus argues that everything reduces to a fiery logos. Now, in the case of Heraclitus, we could think of fire as more of an analogy to what he's trying to describe. So fire, as an analogy, is something that's always changing things. If you put wood into fire, it changes it into ash. And so reality is sort of like that. Things are always changing. And he calls it the fiery logos. Logos is Greek for logic or word, or some sort of rationality. So things are always changing, but they're changing in a rational way. And so for Heraclitus, reality is not a being. Reality is a becoming. And so you could think of the whole notion of being a human being. Heraclitus would say you're not a human being as though you're just stuck in one moment. You're a human becoming. You're always changing. Everything's potential. There's no such thing as pure actuality in Heraclitus's view. Something's always on its way to becoming something else. He has the famous statement that you can't step into the same river twice. And he further argues that it would be absurd to argue that the appearance of change is just an illusion. So for Heraclitus, you might think of two arguments to defend Heraclitus's view. So for one, if things are always appearing to change, then why wouldn't we just go with appearance? Why would we want to restrict ourselves to saying that all of our experiences of change is simply an illusion? Furthermore, you could give an argument for Heraclitus on the basis of free will. So if Zeno and Parmenides are stuck in sort of a deterministic way of looking at the world, Heraclitus would say that if things are changing, then there's room for free will. I can have rational thoughts. My emotions aren't determined. The way I think about things are not determined, and therefore I can come up with a rational argument for what I believe, where he might say that Parmenides and Zeno are just stuck to believe in their deterministic, monistic worldview. And so that is Heraclitus. Now it's going to be interesting when we get to Aristotle later. Aristotle, I think, is really trying to bridge the gap between these two thinkers. So in Parmenides and Zeno, you might say that everything is pure actuality. There's no potential because nothing's ever changing. Whatever is, is. Whereas Heraclitus, everything's potential. There's no actuality. And when we get to Aristotle, what you'll see is that he tries to bring the idea of actual and potential together with his teleological outlook on reality. So again, if we look at Heraclitus and just a brief argument, he uses his own version of a reductio ad absurdum argument to say if, let's just say the B theory of time again is correct, then whatever you believe in the present and whatever you're going to believe in the future, you're just determined to believe that, so why would you ever think that it's rational? So the important point here is to say that it seems as if both monism, the idea that all is one, and the alternative idea, this pluralistic idea that everything is many, things are always changing, it seems as though both reduce to absurdity, and this is where Aristotle is going to be important in a later lecture. After Heraclitus is Empedocles. He is also a pluralist, but he argues that everything reduces to water, earth, air, and fire, and those four substances are all basic together. So he's not picking one basic substance, but he just is picking all the substances in Greek thought. And he also has some interesting ideas. Again, we might think of these as sort of poetic ideas. Central to the universe is love and hate. So there are questions that are coming up at this point in the history of philosophy as to why things change, why do we experience change. It's the same question between why do some things seem to be actual and some things seem to be potential. It's all the same basic type of question. And Empedocles argues that the thing that brings about change, the things that bring about separation and unity, is love and hate. And that's really what's moving the things in the cosmos. So if things are moving, what is it that's doing the moving? For Empedocles, it's these ideas of love and hate. Then, after the Empedocles, you have the atomists, who argue that everything reduces to a potentially infinite number of indestructible atoms. And then you have Anaxagoras, who is an atomist, but he's tries to bring this monistic idea and the pluralism together to say that all is mind. So this accounts for the reason of the cosmos and an infinite number of parts. And so what explains the rational motion of the cosmos? So the Pythagoreans are thinking about this. Why do our mathematical concepts seem to map onto reality? Well, for Anaxagoras, everything is a mind that is bringing reason to the cosmos. But then there are also an infinite number of parts, which, as we get to Plato, he'll describe this distinction between the idea of the forms. So there are these concepts that exist independent of the material world, and the particulars, which would be the when we recognize the forms. So you can have a particular table, or you can have the idea of table, and those two come together for Plato. Anaxagoras is kind of a priming the pump for that way of thinking about reality. So that's all I have for pre-Socratic philosophy. Make sure that you read your textbook closely, and we will talk about the Sophists and Socrates